Hey, Mark.
We're back.
A couple of, 2-3 weeks later than we said we were going to be?
Just 2 weeks.
Yeah, why is that, Mark? Why are we late?
I don't actually have a good reason, do you?
I know that it's probably my fault because, you know what, I was busy staining my deck. So, yeah.
Okay, fair. That's a perfectly reasonable excuse.
Welcome, everyone, to Season 2 of Recreative. We can't believe that we even managed to finish Season 1.
And we're very excited about Season 2, so we hope you are too when you start listening.
Hello, Mark.
Joe, what's the most embarrassed you've ever been? That's a good question, right?
Wow. You know what the fascinating thing is? I drove my daughter to a camp she's working at today.
Yeah.
And she asked me the same question.
No.
Yeah, we talked about some of our most embarrassing moments. And, I've had some doozies. How much are we could devote the entire episode to that.
Okay, well, you don't have to answer the question either. It's a very personal question.
Okay, no, I want to answer it. Okay, no, we're not going to talk about that one. That was too embarrassing. It has to be like the right level of embarrassing.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, like don't tell me something that I absolutely will not be able to scour out of my brain. Don't do that to me.
No. Well, we were okay. This was we were talking. Oh God, can I even? Okay, I can edit this out if I need to. But
can I even?
So okay, here's an embarrassing moment. So standing with a couple of friends in front of an elevator in the Toronto Broadcast Center, and the elevator door opens, and we're all looking to go in, but we can't go in because the elevator's completely packed, and there's a woman there, and I won't use her real name. I'll say Mildred. So Mildred is standing there, and I say, "Look at that, guys. If Mildred wasn't there, we'd be able to fit in the elevator." The three of us. And then the door closed. And then one of my friends says to me, "You know, Joe, if I was Mildred, I don't think I would have appreciated that remark." And immediately I was like humiliated because I'm like, oh my God, I've just completely offended this woman. And she was like a person of some considerable influence at the CBC. So I tried to go and apologize to her, and I couldn't get through all the secretaries and receptionists and everything to even apologize to her. So finally I faxed her. It was back in the days of fax, and I said, "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean anything by that remark." And then she faxed me back and said, "I'm never talking to you again, Joe Mahoney." At which point I knew that she was okay with it.
So you're one of the few people in the world that sent an apology fax.
Yes.
I think that probably puts you in a fairly rare category.
And I do believe it's probably the last fax I ever sent. Okay, now what about you?
Okay, mine goes way back. And hopefully our guest Matt is already thinking about what his is, because we're going to have to ask him after this. So when I was a boy, we lived in England. And it was my first day at this school. It was like a proper English school. It was not a private school as we would consider it, a public school as we consider it. But we had to wear the short pants even in the winter and so on. And so we had a big assembly. It was my first day there, and they'd spent the entire morning walking me around and telling me all about everything and how wonderful it was. And we get to the assembly, and all the kids are sitting on the ground like that we always did when we were kids. And the headmaster, because it wasn't a principal, it was a headmaster, says, "Mark, would you like a seat?" So I stood up in the middle of the assembly and said, "No, I'm fine on the ground with everyone else." And then I realized he was talking to another child who was at the back of the hall who had crutches.
Oh no.
And I don't think I've ever recovered from that, to be honest. I was so humiliated.
Oh dear.
But at least I didn't say yes.
Yes. Yeah. And did everyone turn and look at you? And
oh God, yeah. But it was the least weird thing about me, because I was American.
Yeah, yeah.
I had an American accent, and I said strange things like, "Can you tell me where the garbage is?" And they would "You mean the rubbish?" Garbage. Garbage. But yes.
Okay.
So Matt.
Yeah, we've given Matt plenty of time. Matt Watts, our special guest today.
I don't know if I have a most embarrassing moment, because I was was combing my brain for this. As someone with an anxiety and panic disorder, it's like every day I have some kind of extremely embarrassing moment, or at least a seemingly embarrassing moment. And it's, even if I look back to my childhood, I can't think of something that stands out. So it's possible that either I was just constantly feeling sort of humiliated, or there was never anything that was that humiliating to begin with, which makes me think that maybe I've been looking at my life all wrong, because I don't have a specific story like that. I don't have something where I said, oh yeah, I stood up in front of a group of people and, peed my pants or something like that. I wish I did. I love both your stories. I wish I had something comparable.
It's fine. I mean, I feel like maybe we should have had a trigger warning at the top of this, because I didn't even consider that someone with an anxiety disorder might find that even the question kind of upsetting.
I love it. I don't find it upsetting at all. I mean, I find it upsetting that I don't have something that I can throw into the pot. It's just I live for humiliating stories because the lesson is that you survive them, right? When you have these moments where you feel like this is so embarrassing, how am I going to ever live with this? In the end, they become an anecdote that you tell on a podcast years later to make people laugh. So that's ultimately, that's the lesson. There's no trigger warning. Yeah. It's more like, oh, you'll feel good when you hear this.
Well, and the great thing is your brain will remind you of it, at 4 a.m, just occasionally. Just like, hey, remember that time?
About that. Oh my God. Well,
remember that time you did that thing that everyone laughed at and was really humiliating?
In high school, and I had a lot of moments with a girl that I liked, I'm sure, where I stayed up till 4 a.m. going, oh, why did I say that? Why did I do that? Just constant regret. I mean, I have lots of those.
Yeah.
But nothing like, I live in fear of throwing up in front of a group of people. That would be awful, but it's just never happened.
Wow. Well, that can be arranged. We could get you a bottle of Ipecac and,
oh gosh, no,
throw you a party and then slip it into something.
Yeah. So maybe we should explain who our guest is and why he is, or get him to do that as we usually do.
Get him to do it.
I love the idea of someone explaining me. It reminds me of a joke. Do you remember the movie? It was Flying Deuces, the Laurel and Hardy movie. Hardy decides he's going to kill himself. He's on topic. He's humiliated because of a woman. So he goes down to the river and he's going to tie rocks to himself. He's going to throw himself in the river. And he insists that Stan Laurel go with him. And Stan Laurel says, well, why do I have to die? And then Ollie goes, because if I'm not here, who's going to explain what you are?
That's a great line.
That's a great line.
I don't remember that.
Something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but anyway.
Yeah, that's great.
You can explain me, Joe, or I can explain myself. I'm not entirely sure how to explain myself.
I think you have to explain yourself. We've pretty much made everyone else do it.
Is that how it goes?
Yeah.
That's how it goes, man. That's how we roll. We don't do any homework.
I'm Matt Watts, and a writer, retired actor, comedian. That's the bullet points. I worked with Joe at CBC for years on radio drama series, multiple ones, and have moved into a more quiet suburban life, working on a book right now, and just trying to enjoy my middle age, I think, for the most part.
So you say retired from acting? Is that
that's what I
how
said.
you described it? Why? Is that just because you wanted a quieter, less stressful?
I can't remember. I did something. I was one of the writers on the Amazon Kids in the Hall series that just came out, and so as is tradition, I had a couple little cameo parts in the show. And being on set again, I just realized, well, I really don't like this.
Huh.
I don't enjoy it. I've always been a writer at heart, but then through stand-up and performing, and also, let's be honest, acting is far more soothing and validating for your ego. I enjoyed it, but I enjoyed elements of it. I think I've just come to a place now where I didn't like being on set. I didn't like being in a trailer. I think the pandemic was a part of it too. I just got really comfortable working from home and being at home, and I like being on set with other people. I just don't like being on set as an actor. So, I mean, I'm quasi-retired, right? Like I'm not saying no, never again. I'm just not pursuing it.
Because you're very good at it.
Oh, well, thank you. I also don't like I don't know. I deleted all my social media accounts. I just don't like the public nature of it. I don't know. You know what it is? I feel like I've been in therapy long enough that I don't require the validation that comes with performing. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense to me. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, at a certain point, your fuckometer gets down. You know, it gets empty, and you don't care as much. So
I love to write, and what I enjoy so much about listening to the podcast with you guys is when you talk to other writers and you just sort of get into that. You don't. It's never the focus of the conversation, but it goes there occasionally, and that's the part where I go, oh yeah, I love this talk. I love the talk of the process. And, you know, with acting, I never cared about acting process. Do you know what I mean? When other actors talk about their method, I'm like, I don't care.
Isn't that most people?
Yeah.
Even other actors?
That's part of it too, right? There's the public persona, or there's a public perception of actors. And I'm like, I don't want to be associated with that.
So to the book, because you mentioned, Matt, that you are writing a book, and I've been bugging you for, you know, a decade and a half to get into writing books, because I know you're writing from your script writing, you know, from your television writing, and especially your radio writing. But I always thought that you should be doing books, and now you finally are.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well, I think it's what I wanted to do when I was a kid. It was where I started. In grade school, it was the kind of, you know, ignoring every other assignment. It was just the writing assignments that I enjoyed. And it was that kind of thing where you'd write pages a day and submit them. And I loved the craft. And I think that's what I wanted to do. And then in high school, the allure of like stand up and television, I mean, it's a lot easier, right? Like writing jokes and writing sketches and then writing half-hour episodes. It's like, you know, there's a skill to it, but it's not as many words on a page. And I just sort of let that idea drift away. And then I'd always had an idea for a book that I wanted to explore, and the pandemic happened. And through my television writing agent, because it's a big agency and they have a book agent, a literary agent, they hooked me up with her just to sort of talk to her about the process. And she kind of coached me through most of it, and just checked in with me once a week. How's it going? I read some pages, that kind of thing. And I just cranked out that first draft, and I was shocked that I did it. And then have spent the last year and a half just revising. And I'm almost done this final revision, I think, before it goes out. I felt more in my element writing this than I have anything else in my life. And it's funny because when people talk about how hard it is to write a book, or they're impressed, you know, they go, I can't believe you wrote a book. I think it was remarkably easy in some ways, in terms of like the discipline and the enjoyment of it. I think it was really difficult in other ways, but you know, as someone who's written his entire life, there were certain parts of it that I didn't find as difficult as I think other people would assume it is. And when I hear authors talking about it, about their own process or the craft, you know, I know where my limitations are, but I again, I'm sort of rambling here. I love the craft of it. I love sitting down and I Joe, you know this about me. I'm a big outliner, so I like to outline and hammer that outline, and
we've talked about that.
And then sitting down and with room to, you know, deviate from the outline. But I don't know. It was one of those things where I had an epiphany during the book where I thought, if I could just do this for the rest of my life, I'd never have to. I don't want to write television again. I never want to have to go back to that world. It's so self-contained too. I just really enjoyed amusing myself, to be honest. Yeah. You know, if there's a component of that where it's just like, I'm my own audience here. And obviously I care about what other people think, but it's the most indulgent and immersive writing experience you can have.
Yeah.
And also, you know, I love the idea of writing this thing and it exists finished. Whereas, you know, you write a television show, it's a blueprint for something. You're handing it to actors, and it might not ever get made. That's the biggest part too. The book is done, right? It's the finished product. You can put it out. hopefully other people read it. But even if they don't, it's just out in the world, as opposed to most of the stuff I write ends up in a drawer because it either doesn't get produced or, somebody.
Frustrating.
Yeah, exactly. So it was so satisfying on so many levels that I'm, ready to finish this one and move on to the next one.
There are 3 things I want to say to you. First of all, it's pronounced prose. And second of all, don't worry about the rambling. I will cut that down to 15 words. And the final thing is just a huge reassurance that, as Mark and I can tell you, that there's tons of money in writing.
I know. I can't.
So
wait.
yeah, you should be able to spend the rest of your life doing it.
I know. It's unfortunate, right? Like that's the reality, is that it's not. The chances are there's not going to be a big windfall at the end of this, but that's not why I did it. Again, the only regret I had while I was writing it was that I didn't do it sooner. I did think if I had started on this path in high school and wrote my first book in my early 20s, let's say, and I'm 48 now, how many books could I have written in that period of time?
Oh yeah, and you would be rich. You wouldn't be talking to schmucks like us. Yeah.
No, but then I realized, I was talking to my girlfriend about this yesterday. I said that it would have been such an isolating life. The thing is that I spend a lot of time by myself anyway, and I always have. But as a teenager, getting out to the clubs and doing stand-up and meeting people, it got me a part of maybe a part of a huge community. So I appreciate that. If I would have never met you, Joe, to be honest, right? Like,
that's true.
This is all part. I met you through CBC Radio after working on Newsroom in CBC Television, and so I'm happy for the life I led, but I do wish I'd written some more books earlier.
I really connect with the idea of how it's not narcissistic, but it's very self-involved, the process of writing. And for me, like, this is my favorite time of year because this is the time when I'm not teaching right now, so I have the mental space to draft a book. Yeah. And I've become a pantser. I used to be an outliner. So Matt, get a few more books under your belt and you might become a pantser at some point, because that's happened to me.
Now, is it more exciting for you to?
It's exciting. And every morning I wake up and it's like, oh God, I get to find out what happens next in this story. And I'm always surprised. Well, that's not true. I'm 90% of the time surprised by what happens when I sit down to write, because stuff comes out that I hadn't really thought about or planned. And it's so much fun. But yeah, it's really self-involved. There's no question about that. But I mean, if you can't entertain yourself, you're never going to be able to entertain a reader.
I mean, I guess that's the ultimate expression of it too, is if you're, especially as a pantser, right? If the idea is that you're surprising yourself every day, there's even more enjoyment you're getting out of your own writing.
Yeah. It does mean for more drafts, though. I think that's the one thing I would say, is that at the end of the day, yeah, you're doing I do 4 or 5 drafts now rather than 3.
The book that I wrote, I outlined like a film. And that meant that I got about 1/3 of the way through the outline when I realized it was way too short. And so I started improvising and deviated and wrote a bit by the seat of my pants until I got back to the outline. So there's a huge middle section. And then I had to take the book and card it, like go scene by scene, put it on the wall, and then rearrange the whole book just to make sense of the stuff I'd added. Because I added like 100 pages that didn't necessarily belong where it ended up. And I have to admit that section was the most fun. But I still knew where I was going to end up at a certain point.
I can relate to that. My first book was like that.
So you just turned 48, right?
Yeah.
Douglas Adams. How old was he when he died? Sadly,
was he even 50?
I think he was like 48. We are going to Wikipedia. I can see
right now.
No, I'm leaving it to you, Mark.
Okay, I'm looking right now.
I can see that rosy glow of the computer on your face.
He was 49 years old.
Oh,
49 years old.
Oh my God, he did so much by the age of 49.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, you're just getting started. You got a whole bunch of books in you. But the reason I bring up Douglas Adams.
I'll say this, Wendy, just to interrupt you, but as a 48-year-old first-time novelist, the beauty of books is that there's no such thing as there are a couple, but there are exceptions. There's no like child prodigy authors. It's something that tends to come later for most people because you need the life experience. It's not writing a song that is, passion and gumption. It's, experience and education. And I would argue it's better to write books as you're older. And that's it. That's all. I just wanted to throw that out. That's what I tell myself in the morning. I
agree that, I've always thought that being interested in writing books is great because it's something that you can do your entire life, presumably.
Yes.
As opposed to, I went to school with guys who are hugely into sports and they wanted to be, sports stars, hockey stars, basketball stars. And there's a shelf life on that. Mm-hmm. And then you got to figure out what you're going to do afterwards. But with books, you can spend your whole life going, I'm going to write that book eventually. And then you're 70 years old. I can still do it.
I just saw today that Bram Stoker was 50 when he wrote Dracula.
Mm-hmm. I did not know that.
Yeah. And the other thing about writing is that, you can continue to get better.
Yeah.
As even in your 80s, you can get better.
Hell, I noticed that from revision to revision.
Yeah.
I'm just even on the first book, I was looking at some first draft stuff and I thought, holy cow. This is garbage.
I think James Michener was writing to his late 80s, early, he died at 91. He was still writing.
Yeah, I was really lucky. I got a chance to talk with, he wrote The Manticore and
Robertson Davies.
I hate it when that happens. Robertson Davies, thank you.
Yeah.
I got a chance to meet him and he was in his 80s and he was writing still and he was still writing really good books. So that's one of the great things about writing is that it's you can keep doing it and you can keep improving too.
Well, and he did absolutely get better as he went along. At one point he said, it was after my parents died. That's when I finally was able to
That's interesting.
Because all the self-consciousness went away.
Really interesting.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
There's a lot there.
So, Matt, you were going to talk about, so the irony is we've been talking about books and now you're going to talk about a radio show.
Well, I'm going to talk about a radio show that most people know as a book, which is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams.
I've never heard of that. Can you tell us about it?
You've never heard it? I was just going to say, I believe we've all read it and heard the series, but apparently Joe hasn't. I was hard pressed to figure out what single piece of artwork influenced me the most. And so I had to just think about my childhood and what I loved as a kid. And with Hitchhikers, I can remember all the steps that got me there. And I had a friend. I have no siblings, but I had friends who there was a guy named Derek Rayner when I was a kid. He was the older brother of a girl who I went to school with. And Derek introduced me to Holy Grail. And Holy Grail, I was 10, I think. And it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. And that set me down a path. And I'm one of these guys, and I have always been my entire life. If you introduce me to something that I really like, I start going down the rabbit hole of, who influenced them, who else was in that world, like that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so with Grail, I went on to Python, Goon Show, and then eventually the first book of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I was probably about 12 when I read it, 11 or 12. And I read that book back to front, that and Restaurant, as many times as I could. I was, because at that age also you repeat a lot of what you're reading. You read it over and over, or you watch the same movies multiple times. I read that book so many times. And then I didn't know it was at a radio show. I happened to be in the world's biggest bookstore, and they had that large, the audio section, cassettes and things. And they had this big clamshell box of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I was like, what is this? At first I thought it was just a book on tape. And on the back of the cover, it said BBC radio series. So I used my allowance. I bought it. I took it home. I listened to the first episode and it blew my mind. And that was it. And I was hooked and I listened to the whole thing and started, because then they'd put out LPs. They re-recorded I think the first 4 episodes or the first 6, the first phase with the same actors, and that was it. So that's it. And I think that shaped my sense of humor, my love of science fiction. Even it all kind of stems from Hitchhikers. And then also as a kid I was into Doctor Who, and when I found out that Douglas Adams had written some of the most exciting Doctor Who episodes, at least from my generation, right? It was Tom Baker. And things like it was the City of Death. Like those episodes were were big, big episodes when I was a kid. So it all came down to him. And I don't know what year it was that Dirk Gently came out, but I skipped school and I went to the world's biggest bookstore and I met the man and he signed my book and he said, where'd you get that pin? I was wearing a Don't Panic pin. And I said it was from the Infocom Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy video game. And I thought it was weird that he didn't know that. And that was it. That was my brief little meeting with the man.
So, okay. So a couple of things. Number one, the radio version came before the books, right?
Correct.
And then he wrote the books.
He had a crazy whirlwind year there where he was a writer on Python. If I remember correctly, he had an idea. It was going to be like a series, an anthology series, and each episode was about the world ending. And then it grew into Hitchhikers. And I don't know if he had an order for a full series or an order for a pilot, but he did the show and it was successful. And a publisher was interested in turning it into a book. Meanwhile, there was a second series, and then also they wanted a TV series of it. And then he was doing all this while he was show running Doctor Who. So there was a period of like 2 or 3 years there where he had a million things on the go.
Yeah.
And several of them were Hitchhikers related.
Wow. And now, okay, the other thing is that we asked Gus to come on this show and talk about something which has inspired them. And you're presenting us a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the radio version. And it absolutely, completely, obviously inspired you, because then you went on to actually make radio plays for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is where I met you.
Well, and it's interesting because I had listened to radio shows before that. Remember, when I was a kid, you could get records out of the library of like The Shadow or The Green Hornet or Superman, the old 40s radio stuff. So I'd heard it and I loved that stuff. But then Hitchhikers, it all kind of coalesced. And then, I had always loved this idea of doing radio drama. And I'd started developing this idea for television, to be honest, called Steve the First, a post-apocalyptic comedy in the vein of Hitchhikers. I mean, I'm sure if we listened to it today, we'd be like, at the time, even we knew it had Hitchhikers all over it. Too much so that it kind of, doesn't totally work because, what makes Hitchhikers so great is the kind of Winnie the Pooh rhythmic Britishness of it.
Yeah. His voice helps a lot, I think.
Exactly. And then I pitched it as a television series. And then someone, it might have been Mark McKinney, suggested it as a radio series. And I pitched it to someone at CBC, our friend Tom Anico.
Right.
And he picked it up for a pilot. And then I recorded a pilot. And I got the first mix and I hated it. And then meanwhile, they'd ordered the other 5. And when we went in to record episode 2, there was an engineer there who had heard the pilot and started telling me everything that was wrong with the mix of the pilot. And I agreed with him 100%. And that man was Joe Mahoney. And
I was so obnoxious back then.
You were. I vividly remember the day of you sitting at the board and us having this conversation and leaving and saying, Joe's got to work on the show. He's got to work on the pilot. I want him to remix it. And it was a very complicated thing because it was being mixed in Winnipeg, and I had to fight to have it taken away from whoever was mixing it there. And no offense to that person, but you just had a better handle on it. And also I could be with you because I couldn't go to Winnipeg. So Joe and I started working together, and I would go to the studio with you while you mixed. And do you remember while I was writing episode 2, you were mixing and I was on the floor with cards trying to card the episode, listening to you mix. And I was like, Joe, what do you think about this? And it became a very, very quick friendship and collaboration.
Well, we were completely simpatico, which was how I felt about it. It is the most fun I had in the decade that I spent making radio plays at CBC. And that's saying a lot because I had a lot of fun during that decade. And I will say about the guy who we took the mix away from, I felt obviously very awkward about that. So I had phoned him up and said, listen, this is what we're thinking. It's kind of awkward. Do you mind? And he was incredibly gracious about it because he was actually an extremely talented recording engineer for music. And that was his thing. And he didn't have the background in radio plays, but I couldn't do music the way that he could do music. So we each had our specialties. So it just made sense.
Like I said, it was no offense to him. It just wasn't the right fit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I lived out my dream of doing a Hitchhikers-like show with CBC and Joe.
It was 1987, by the way.
1987 is
Dirt Gently.
When. So I was 12.
Okay.
Just in case there's some listeners screaming at their.
So I was 12. I was 12 years old, and so I must have read Hitchhikers way earlier than that.
I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Because by Dirk Gently's, I was well versed in the whole thing. I mean, that's it. That's the age, right? That you're.
Oh, like, absolutely, yeah. Because I mean, I think
you're like a sponge.
It's what blows me away is there's about 9 years difference in our age, but I have so many of the same influences. Like Python for me, like imprinted on my brain because I saw it on television. So we're going back to the year I was embarrassing myself in England. I saw it live that year. I think it was probably the last season, but yeah.
Oh, season 4.
The
weird year.
Well, but at least it was probably also in reruns too, because I mean they reruns. Because I remember seeing Tom Baker back then too. I don't mind it when he was supposed to be. When was he the doctor?
Well, he was the doctor before he was the doctor in the 70s, so I would have been too young to actually see it because I was born in 75.
Yeah, because I remember watching Doctor Who, and I think it was Tom Baker. It was the guy with the scarf, right?
Yeah. And that, I mean, when I was a kid, the one I remember the most was this one called Brain of Morbius, and I think it was that TVO here aired them they weren't airing them immediately because I think I would have been too young, but they must have been.
So yeah, I just got lucky that I happened to get introduced to Python really early, and it was great because it was something that I could watch with my father, and he would get all of the adult humor, but Python was just so stupid too.
Yeah,
I mean, great jokes about philosophers and so on, but some of the stuff was like the mystery of funny walks and so on. Like,
I think kids could pick up on that stuff though, because it's like remember also there was Benny Hill. Yes. And it was like Benny Hill was funny, but it wasn't as good. It's kind of like I think about when I was a kid, there was the Frantics, and then there was the Royal Canadian Air Farce on Saturday mornings on CBC Radio. I love the Frantics. I did not like the Air Farce. My dad liked the Air Farce. I don't know if he liked it. There was definitely, I don't know. There was just something. There was something cooler about that stuff. There was just even though you're a kid, I think you can pick up on those things.
Yeah. I wonder how many people have been influenced by Python in our generations. Like, well, you're Gen Xer too, so we're the same generation, but
they're like comedy Steven Spielberg.
You know what I mean? Basically, yeah. Like they set the template for a lot of our sense of humor, I think, for an entire generation.
Yeah.
So you said Douglas Adams actually wrote for Python. I did not know that.
No, I didn't know that either. Yeah.
I don't know if he wrote that much. I think he wrote for Graham Chapman, or he sort of co-wrote some sketches with him. I don't know if he was an official writer on the show, but I know he did some work with Chapman. And around that 4th season, I think it was in that 4th season. And
I know they partnered up, the Pythons, and wasn't Graham Chapman partnered with John Cleese? And
and then that last season he wasn't part of it, so that makes sense to me that he would have needed a partner.
Right. I think that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. So I wonder, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so the radio series, we know that the spirit influenced you, and certainly when we were making radio plays with CBC, in my mind, and I think perhaps in yours as well, we were trying to make that breakout hit. We were trying to make the Canadian Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And we thought that we could if only the CBC got behind us, and they kind of never really did. But okay, so beyond the spirit of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, was there anything else specifically that influenced you? I think for a kid like me, and I think this speaks true for a lot of kids who Hitchhikers resonated with, Hitchhikers is the most emotionally resonant book or radio series. But there's something about Douglas Adams' view of the world and the galaxy that sort of absurdism, and he got a lot of humor out of things not making sense. He laughed at the nonsensical nature of the world. And I think for a kid who's struggling to understand how things work or trying to make sense of things and can get really anxious or frustrated at not being able to understand how things work, having material that pokes fun at that and says nothing makes sense
and it's funny because nothing makes sense. I think that was incredibly reassuring for me. And I'm sure, again, like I said, I think for a lot of people who it really, really resonated with. I think there's a real common thread to the kids that loved Python, loved Hitchhiker's Guide. It's laughing at the absurdity of the world. And when you're a kid, you need that. Especially if you're coming from like a broken home, or, there's fighting in the house, like it's looking for something that makes sense of all of it, or at least says there is no sense to make, and that's okay too. It's so clever. And when you're a kid, you want to feel clever. So when you get the jokes, you feel like you're clever. Although it's funny because I just remembered that in grade school, I wrote a report on the peril sensitive sunglasses. And I completely misread it. I thought they said pearl sensitive sunglasses. So I was like, again, I must have been 10 or 11. I didn't understand the joke. And then I remember learning what they actually meant. Oh, there was an embarrassing moment. There you go.
There you go. You got one. There you go.
Yeah. I was very embarrassed to realize I'd written a whole report on pearl sensitive sunglasses. And I was like, oh, peril as in danger. Oh, that makes way more sense.
It's like, oh, never mind.
Yeah.
Well, I remember for me, a part of the Douglas Adams brilliance was lines like, it hung in the air the way bricks don't.
Yeah.
Which when I read that, I'm like, oh my God, how did he come up with that? That's brilliant. Like, okay, so that line in Douglas Adams is genius to me.
It's all genius. Like, that's the thing about that book is I can't believe, he was a pantser too, right? Like, he kind of just wrote it as he came up with it. And there's stuff in there that you just go, geez, it's just like that just sort of flew out of his brain.
Well, and he didn't even want to write it. Like, the first book is only 160, 180 pages long.
Yeah. It's like the first 3 episodes of the show.
By the end of it, they had to like lock him into a hotel room to make him write anything. And, you're not allowed out of this hotel room until you finish writing, Dirk Gently.
I believe that first book ends where it does because that was the deadline. It was like, you're done now. We have to take it away from you. And that's why it kind of ends in a let's go to the Millie ways, right? It's just sort of a weird to be continued.
And of course, you know what he said about deadlines.
I was going to say that's my email signature. It's I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they fly by.
Yeah. But you're writing, because I would read Matt's scripts, before we made them, with an eye towards, making some suggestions. I would usually have my obnoxious suggestions that I would make, but there would always be some bits and some lines that I would just think, holy cow, like this guy is funny, and like
nice.
you're coming up with stuff that I don't know how you come up with it. So,
it's just, I think part of it's just a sketch background, just sort of like, I remember Bob Martin, he said that the best way to approach a show is just treat every scene like a sketch. What's the game in the scene? So, it's just geared towards trying to find humor. And sometimes it's stupid, absurd stuff. And sometimes it's wordplay, and sometimes it's a joke, and, always just try to find something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think also we just have a similar sense of humor. I just say also, I think you found me funny because we share a brain. I don't think everybody finds my stuff funny. I think I'd be a lot more successful if they did.
Yeah. Well, actually, I've been looking back at some of my earlier work, and my overwhelming impression is that, man, I was weird. My stuff is weird, and I'm like, to an extent that I did not appreciate, I think, when I was creating it.
I don't know. Weird's good.
Oh, you know what I was this is a side note, but the Hitchhiker's Guide TV show, I remember really disliking, and I still don't like it. I can't watch it, because I don't want to see what any of that stuff looks like. I had both based on the book and the radio series. I had an image of Marvin. I had an image of Zaphod.
Yeah.
And then the TV show just could not do either of them justice. And it felt slow as a result.
What did you think of the movie?
I didn't mind the movie so much, but I thought it was really interesting because Adams did a pass on it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know how much of it, but he really tried to bolster Trillion's character, because in the radio series and the book, she's just nothing.
Yeah.
And I thought they did a passable job. I like the Henson Muppets. Like I like the Henson.
Yeah.
The Vogons looked incredible. And I really liked Sam Rockwell as Zaphod. I thought he was perfect.
I actually really liked Stephen Fry doing the narration.
He was great too.
Yeah, I thought he was perfect because I think I didn't have that voice in my head because I didn't know who Stephen Fry was when I read the book, but it kind of like matched up with the tone I thought in my head when I read the book originally. Because unlike you, I read the book before. I did actually hear the radio series, or one of the seasons, the second time I lived in England in the early 80s, but it wouldn't have been live. It would have been a replay, I would guess, right?
Yeah, they were never live. You mean it would never been like the first time it was broadcast?
Yeah, it wasn't like when it was first released.
No, because I don't even know when that was, when the first season aired. It was in the mid to late 70s, maybe?
Mid 70s, probably, yeah. 77, maybe? But it was funny because I caught her on the radio. I think my mom was listening to something, and then I went, wait a minute, don't change that. That's Douglas Adams. And I loved it. I was there every day, but I knew the story, of course, because I'd read the books. But I still love listening to it.
It's just so inventive, and it's so, again, sci-fi is so tricky because, there's so many different aspects, or there's so many different ways you can go about it. Like, how close is it to our contemporary world? Or how realistic is it? How grounded is it? And then Hitchhikers is just kind of a mishmash of everything. You have the infinite improbability drive. Everything that he writes makes sense. It's like, but it's all adhering to his own logic. Like the whole thing about flying, just throw yourself at the ground and miss. Like, and on the surface, it sounds ridiculous, but then you think about it for a second and you go, right, of course, that there's a logic there. And that's everything he writes. And I think I respond to that too. I could never really get into Terry Pratchett that much because I thought he was a little too fantasy driven, and I could never really nail down the internal logic of his worlds. But people always compared him to Douglas Adams too, I guess just because of the humor. But I find that Douglas Adams stuff, it's grounded in it sounds scientific, even if it isn't.
Well, and the impact on science fiction, you cannot write humorous science fiction without being compared to Douglas Adams.
Mm-hmm. And there's a big,
that is
so
true.
You guys would know way more about this than I do, but there's a real bias against humor in science fiction, isn't there? Or is there? Yeah.
Yep.
Oh yeah, I think there is. Yeah, it's very hard to write funny science fiction. It's also just to start with. It's very hard to write a novel that's funny.
Right.
Any long form narrative, it's challenging to do the thing because you don't have all the ability that you have in stand up. You're not there, so you can't react to what people are doing. You can't even do sort of personal interplay like you can with a sketch. You can sort of do that a little bit in terms of setting up the scenario, but yeah, it's really challenging to write humorous anything in a long form. And then I think in science fiction, there's an additional hurdle, which is you're always going to be compared to Douglas Adams.
Yeah,
it's kind of inevitable. And so then to do something that's somewhat original, then you're fighting against that a little bit, I think.
It's interesting. I didn't even think about that. Because you're right. When I read Hitchhikers, or listened to, I guess we're deviating from we're talking more about the book, which is fine. We're talking about Hitchhikers, the property, the IP.
It's all good. It's all still in the genre,
But you're right. It was really funny. And how often have you read a book, let alone a science fiction book, that made you laugh out loud?
Yeah.
And it's true. You're right. I mean, I just read this book called, I had to Google it because I forgot, and my brain is like a sieve, but it was called The Book of Joe. Coincidentally, Joe. It's called The Book of Joe by Jonathan Tropper. And it made me laugh a lot. And I thought, right, other than, like a David Sedaris collection of short stories, it's not very often that you read a book that makes you laugh while you're reading it. And I hadn't even thought about that. But yeah, exactly. And Douglas Adams did that.
Well, and interestingly, all of us here, write or attempt to write amusing prose.
I mean, I've tried to write a funny book, but I'm sure, I don't know. it could be one of those things like, oh, this doesn't work.
But a lot of it for Adams though, just is his voice. Because one of my favorite Adams books is actually not fiction. It's the book he wrote called Last Chance to See.
Love that book. Yeah.
Which is a beautiful book. It's and hilarious. Yeah. I mean, I've got the scene of him going to, I can't remember what the islands are in Indonesia, where he's going to see the Komodo dragons, and there's chickens in the front of the boat. Yeah. And he knows what the chickens are for. The chickens don't know what the chickens are for. And that's burned in my mind. And it's so funny.
Well, and anybody listening who has read Hitchhiker's Guide, I would say you have to run out. And if you haven't read it, read Adams' Last Chance to See, because I think it's his best work, which obviously is saying a lot. I
agree.
I wonder if it's even available.
That's a good question. It was, okay, I can tell you when it was written.
It's, there's certain authors, well, occasionally it's like one of Stephen King's best books is on writing.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
Michael Crichton wrote a book called Travels. Did you ever read that? And it was about his travels overseas and his travels in the world, and also his travels he went to meditation resorts and he went to past life regressions, and it was an external and internal book of travels. It was fascinating. I mean, I read this as a teenager. I don't know if it holds up, but I always remember it sort of standing out. It's like, wow, every now and then these fiction writers will write something of nonfiction and it's just as good. And I wish that they did more of it.
It was 1990 and it is available. So for Last Chance to See.
Oh, good. Yeah, people should read that.
Anything else you want to say, Matt, about Hitchhiker's Guide, the radio show?
I thought that the actors were all very good in it. Simon Jones was perfect.
He was the narrator?
Peter Jones was the narrator. Simon Jones is Arthur Dent.
Oh, okay.
I still listen to it from time to time. I haven't in a while. They continued it. They did the tertiary phase, and recently, in the last 20 years, they adapted the third, fourth, and fifth book to radio drama. I never really listened to them. I couldn't really get into them. Just like the later books too. Like I don't know if you read Life, the Universe. Of course you guys read Life, the Universe and everything. But it is not, there's a significant drop off after Restaurant for me. They get a little dull. I like the Life, the Universe and everything has that bistro math. The ship that is powered by bistro math. I like that. But
what book has the whale? That's
the first.
That's the first book? Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, you know what the third one has that's a great little bit is the
pot of petunias?
It's the guy who he's immortal and he's decided to go through the universe and insult everybody to their face. And then there's the guy who keeps getting reincarnated, and because every time he dies, it's Arthur Dent who kills him. Yes. And we find out that he was the bowl of petunias.
Yeah, he was and the whale.
And the whale.
Oh no, not again. Oh no, not again.
Yeah, that was what that was referencing. He was the guy who keeps getting reincarnated and killed by Arthur Dent.
And now something else which is kind of odd about Hitchhiker's Guide, the theme. Journey of the Sorcerer, wasn't it?
Yeah, by the Eagles.
By the Eagles, yeah. How would they... Doesn't that strike you guys as kind of odd that they would pick like an American, Southern...
From what I remember, Adams was a big music guy, right? Like he was good friends with David Gilmour of Pink Floyd, and, I think he just... I don't even know if he was a stoner.
Well, that kind of makes sense to me.
His music taste seemed to be stoner music. And Journey of the Sorcerer is definitely like something... stoners would have listened to, I think.
It doesn't even sound like the Eagles.
It's a very comforting song for me, and I don't know if it's the song itself or it's because I associate it with the show.
That's a great song.
And some of his characters, Zaphod Beeblebrox is pretty American.
Yeah.
That's an American character. There's no question that's American.
Well, the name, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, and Mark Wayne Davies playing him with an American accent.
Yeah, that's lots of people named Zaphod in Iowa.
It's the sheer creativity of the whole series that I'll never, I think is unmatched in ways. Because going back to my point about science fiction, Joe, we had this, I remember, so Mark, one of the series that we did was a show called Canada, and the way I pitched it was because Joe and I had done these post-apocalyptic things. there's a limitation in radio in the sense that there's no limitation. You can just come up and do whatever you want. It's like anything you can imagine, you can record. And I found it exhausting because it's almost pressure to come up with these incredibly creative things like Adams did. It's just everything he touched, it was just so unbelievably creative and inventive. So the last series I did was all set on, I pitched it as Barney Miller in space. So it was just on a ship, and it was a crew of a ship, because I just didn't want to have to think about that stuff anymore, because I'm not as creative as someone like Douglas Adams.
I beg to differ.
And I think he's someone who utilized the radio to its fullest potential by just, going, like the Zaphod thing is a perfect example. It was meant as a radio joke, him having two heads, because it's the same actor delivering both lines. It's something you're never going to see. And then the television show and the film both had to try to figure out how to make that work.
And Sam Rockwell was good as Zaphod, I thought.
Yeah. And well, to your point of him being American, and then I think Sam Rockwell played him as the ultimate American, right? He was basically doing Bush.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great.
Mark, what do you think? Any final thoughts on?
I'm just really happy to talk about Douglas Adams in any capacity at all. He's a joy.
It was a real loss when he died.
It was.
And a shock.
I don't think I've had a lot of like celebrity deaths that have impacted me over my life. Weirdly, the other one was John Ritter, but Douglas Adams was a big one when he died. I remember exactly where I was, and that sinking feeling of how could he be gone? It's just like he was such an influence, and he was so young.
He was very young.
Well, it's one thing if they die when they're like 102. You're like, oh, that's sad, 102, but pretty good life. But 48, 49? No, that's, way, way too young.
I think it depends. Leonard Cohen, when he died, I was pretty gutted, but, he was fairly old, or he wasn't young.
See, there's a good question. Celebrity deaths that impacted you. Who were you upset? Leonard Cohen.
Well, Kurt Vonnegut. The only person I was as upset about was Kurt Vonnegut. I was very upset.
He was praying for death.
I know, he was fine with being dead.
You remember his joke about? Cigarettes, like suing? Suing
the company.
Yeah, because they hadn't fulfilled their promise of killing him.
They hadn't delivered. Yeah,
that's funny.
I was told I would die of cancer, and you did not deliver.
Vonnegut's his story arc. His live, basically TED Talks on the structure of story. I use that.
Oh, that's fabulous.
That's how I structure stories, is I do it as a graph. I very much use his method. I think it's for certain people with certain kind of brains, it makes 100% perfect sense.
Vonnegut keeps, he's a recurring theme on this podcast for sure, But okay, celebrities. So Ed Asner, and you actually worked with Ed Asner, which must have been super cool. He did these spots on climate change, and I remember the one line, and he was already, quite up there when he uttered this line. He's like, "Oh, I don't worry about that. That's an after I'm dead problem." Another great line.
That's kind of the problem we're facing, though, isn't it?
I have a few good Ed Asner stories, and I'll tell you my favorite one was. We were out to dinner, and, he walked with a cane towards the end of his life, and he was very slow. But then I got up to go to the bathroom, and he decided he had to go to the bathroom as well. And he ran past me to get to the bathroom. He really had to go. And then I peed next to him, and he was just making such perfect old man whooping and, like noises as he peed. Just, woo!
That's a spicy meatball.
Yeah, he was great. He was so much fun.
That's great.
That's all I got.
Wow. Well, okay. And actually, that's a great...
How can we not end on
exactly. That's right. Yeah. Matt, thank you very much for being on our podcast, Recreative.
Thank you for having me. I'm so flattered you asked me to do it. Or maybe I suggested it. I can't remember. maybe I said, Joe, I got to do your podcast.
Awesome to meet you.
No, we're delighted to have you on, and as we say to all of our guests, we may well have you on again.
I'd love to.
Yeah.
Thanks. That was fun.
Thanks, guys.
So, Mark, you and I have discussed how people can support this podcast, and one of the ways I would like to get them to support us is by, and I think you're going to like this, by purchasing one of your books.
Ooh, I like that. How about your books?
We're going to start with your
We'll
books.
start with my books? Okay.
And today I would like to point people in particular to Alpha Max, which is a novel about the metaverse, which is kind of in vogue these days.
Yeah, and it doesn't take a lot of the standard approaches that the metaverse stories do. I think it's a bit more grounded.
It's funny and it's witty and it's smart and it's entertaining.
Go to recreative.ca/support and you can find our books there.
Alpha Max by Mark A. Rayner.